What is a buffered schedule?
A buffered schedule is one to which free float has deliberately been added. It is when we take negotiated additional schedule time and add it to the schedule as planned delays between the finish of activities and the start of activities that are dependent on them. It does not make sense to buffer any of the activities that are not on the critical path, because this would mean that we would just be adding additional free flow to activities, and the completion date of the project would still be determined by the critical path activities. Figure 519 shows a project with an early schedule completion date. Figure 518, installing a new floor, fast-tracked schedule. Figure 519, schedule without contingency. Of May 30th. The project manager gives the stakeholder a promise to complete the project on July 30th. Figure 520 is the buffered schedule that is created by the project manager. The amount of time that the schedule is to be buffered is determined by the difference between the promise date that is given to the stakeholders and the late finish date of the project. The late finish of the project is equal to the latest late finish of the last finishing activity of the project. The buffer time is distributed to the activities according to some scheme. One of the most popular methods of doing this is by using Goldratt's critical chain method, which we will discuss later in this chapter. It can be distributed among the activities of the project according to any scheme that is appropriate for the specific project. Figure 520, schedule with buffer. Tell me more. Many project schedules are driven by unrealistic mandated completion dates. This has something to do with the psychology of people outside the project. Some stakeholders require projects to be done by mandated completion dates that have little to do with when the project is actually needed. The reason for this is that many of these stakeholders have had disappointingly bad experiences with project managers who did not adhere to schedules. These people request that projects be done as soon as possible because they are certain that there will be delays. By asking for projects to be completed as early as possible, they feel that the inevitable delay will be added to an earlier promise date, and the actual completion of the project will be earlier. Of course, this is also a case of wish fulfillment. If people assume that projects will always be late, projects probably will always be late. Of course, if our stakeholder really has a situation where he wants to crash or fast-track his own project schedule, he wants our project completed as soon as possible and probably wants to take the risk that we will not complete on time in order to take advantage of being able to finish early. In this situation, the customer is not likely to agree to the delay we suggest as a means of improving the probability of being able to adhere to the promise date. Most project schedules have probably had a pretty bad track record and have not met their promise dates. One of the reasons for this is that many project schedules are developed by taking the most likely durations of the activities and using them to predict the most likely project duration and thus the project completion date. We can think of the possible project completion dates as points on a non-symmetrical probability distribution as shown in Figure 521. We can see that the most likely date has the highest probability of occurring. This date is even earlier than the PERT expected completion date that was developed in our discussion about PERT. If the probability distribution curve were symmetrical, the most likely value of the project completion date would have a 50% chance of predicting that the actual project completion date would be earlier. See Figure 522. Of course, this means that the project would also have a 50% probability of being later than the most likely project completion date. In the case of the non-symmetrical distribution, the actual project completion date has a greater than 50% probability of being later than the most likely date. The question that project managers need to ask themselves is, am I willing to promise a stakeholder a project completion date that has a 50% probability of being late? One of the first things that must be done to buffer a schedule is to convince the stakeholders and sometimes our own management that we will use the schedule change wisely to improve the reliability of the promised completion date. Usually explaining that there is a 50% probability that the project will be delivered late will get everyone's attention. Once you have their attention, explain the real meaning of the most likely date for project completion. Figure 521, Probability of Promise Dates. Figure 522, Will the project be late? Suppose we have a situation in which we are doing a project for a client that depends on our project in order to be able to move forward with a larger project. An example of this might be if our project is to build a machine for a customer that would use the machine to manufacture their product. If we promised the machine to the customer on a specific date, such as 200 days, it is likely that the customer will discontinue the use of its old system to make way for the new machine we are supplying. If we fail to deliver the machine as promised, our customer will have no means of production because the old equipment it had been using has been removed to make way for the new equipment. If we are very late in our delivery, the consequences could be enormous. What we want to do in this case is promise the client a project completion date that has a higher reliability or probability of occurring,